Germany was one of the last major powers to establish a colonial empire, and it turned out to be one of the shortest lived in modern history. In just over 30 years, the German Reich created and controlled a number of overseas colonies, but that came to a sudden end when Germany was defeated in World War I. And during those 3 decades, like the other colonial powers of the time, Germany used racist ideologies to justify the oppression and exploitation of other peoples.
There was a widespread belief that the world was like a jungle, nations locked in constant competition where only the strongest survive. And more than that, the strongest had the right to dominate the weak.
And the German Empire wanted to be the strongest.
Germany saw itself as a latecomer to colonialism, but one determined to prove it could be the most effective colonizer of them all. And that ambition ultimately led to the first genocide of the 20th century.
Und das führte eben zu diesem ersten Genozid des 20. Jahrhunderts.
This video is about the 3 decades of German colonial rule, including exploitation, abuse, and genocide. First, let's see how it all began. Part 1. Late to the game. Germany started colonizing other countries centuries after the English, Spanish, and Portuguese started conquering and colonizing.
The reason's simple. Before 1871, there was no unified German nation-state capable or willing to act globally.
While Spain and England had strong centralized governments and started building empires as early as the 16th century, it took Germany more than 300 years to unite and to venture into other territories. Before 1871, the German-speaking world was fragmented into small kingdoms, duchies, and independent states, each with its own interests. That started to change in the 19th century when nationalism began to take hold in German-speaking lands, fueled by the ideals of the artistic and cultural movement known as Romanticism. People began pushing for unification, which became a reality after Germany defeated France in the Franco-Prussian War. On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, King Wilhelm I of Prussia was declared German Emperor. The German nationalists saw their dream come true.
Back then, Germany was swept up in a kind of hyperventilating nationalism. It was fueled by decades of propaganda from journalists, writers, and politicians, aiming to steer public opinion toward unification.
Otto von Bismarck, the great architect of this unification, became the first chancellor of this new empire. Known as the Iron Chancellor, he began his term as one of the biggest critics of colonial ambitions, which he made clear shortly after taking office. I don't want any colonies at all. For us, colonies would be exactly like a sable fur for Polish noble families that have no shirts.
Bismarck thought colonialism was pointless. He believed it would provoke conflict with other European powers, cost a lot of money, and drag Germany into endless military entanglements. He saw it as an adventure that would pull money and troops into the colonies. It would lead to losses, costs, and would lead to rivalries. And in the end, he was absolutely right.
But as soon as the new empire came into being, those who wanted to jump on the colonial bandwagon started gaining influence. As they saw it, it was now or never.
Germany's unification had come through military victory over 2 major European powers, Austria-Hungary and France. The public mood was characterized by a touch of megalomania. Germany finally saw itself as a world power, sitting at the big table. They were now a superpower.
This nationalism permeated public opinion, which put Germany under increasing pressure to follow other major European powers and to create its own colonial empire. In March 1884, Otto von Bismarck finally agreed to establish the first German protectorates in Africa. But why did the Iron Chancellor suddenly change his mind? Was he influenced by politicians and merchants looking for raw materials and new markets?
That's
one explanation, but I find another one more compelling. In 1884, Wilhelm I is still the Kaiser, but he's almost 90 and is often out of action for health reasons. His son, Crown Prince Frederick, later Frederick III, is expected to succeed him soon. And Frederick told Bismarck in 1884 that he intended to rule with the liberals, ideally in a British-style parliamentary system. Bismarck, a hardline conservative, was horrified, so he tried to sabotage any alliance with Britain so that the Anglophile Frederick would be unable to work with them. And the fastest way to provoke the British, start trying to acquire colonies, because the British won't like that, especially in Africa, where they are very active. It worked. Frederick backed down. We know he told Bismarck he would not work with the liberals on the parliamentary model, but would keep him as chancellor. And suddenly, Bismarck lost all interest in colonialism, just as fast as he had gained it. That's the cynicism of Bismarck. He was willing to go against his own convictions and approve the creation of a colonial empire, which makes it all the more damning, because he knew the human cost, the humanitarian cost, and all the other costs it would bring.
Part 2. Lies. German colonial expansion into Africa had actually already begun in 1883. A German tobacco merchant named Franz Adolf Lüderitz had already started conducting business there. Lüderitz sent a representative to the coast of what's today Namibia. He initially acquired a 5-mile stretch of land around Enga Bay from a leader of the Nama people, in exchange for 200 old rifles and 100 pounds sterling. A few months later, Lüderitz gained much more land in a pretty dirty deal. The entire coast between the Orange River and the 26th parallel, as well as 20 miles inland. This time, the price was 60 guns and 500 pounds sterling. These territories became known as Lüderitzland, and they were basically achieved through deception. Lüderitz and his representatives deliberately used German geographical miles, which measured about 7.5 kilometers, instead of the English miles of 1.6 kilometers that were familiar to the Nama. That's how Adolf Lüderitz earned the nickname Lügenfritz, or Fritz the Liar. From then on, Lüderitz sent more and more expeditions in search of raw materials. He bought more and more land from local leaders. In a short time, he controlled 580,000 square kilometers, home to around 200,000 people from various rival groups.
In Namibia, then called German Southwest Africa, you had at least 3 major groups, the Herero, Nama, and Ovambo. They were rivals who fought each other. Then the Europeans came, and they tried to ally themselves with this new force, to use them to fight their local enemies. But these local allies sometimes switched sides because over time, locals realized they had invited a new opponent into their land.
Indigenous groups like the Herero or Nama recognized too late that the new arrivals had not come to help them.
You have to see that colonialism was a racially structured system of injustice, a massive act of theft, or better yet, armed robbery. Europeans invaded lands they didn't come from, weren't invited to, and took what they wanted. By the 19th century, this was underpinned by biological racism. Europeans' supposed superiority was justification for it all.
That's how the new arrivals legitimized forcing the local population to submit to their control.
In addition to contracts of sale, Germany used so-called protection treaties to gain control, signed between German authorities and local chiefs and kings, often under duress and through intimidation. Soldiers marched in to impress the locals. Warships went in to show off German might.
Soldados delante de las comunidades o mostrando grandes cañoneras para demostrar la fuerza militar de Alemania. Una vez
Once the treaties were signed, Germany ruled in two ways: directly through colonial administrations, in particular along the coasts, where a German administration was constituted.
Se montaba toda una administración alemana y la otra posibilidad,
or indirectly, deeper inland, where it was less accessible and there was not as much German presence.
había menor presencia de alemanes y eran de más difícil acceso.
In this case, once the protection agreement was signed, local communities were left to their own devices, provided, of course, that they fulfilled the obligations imposed by the German colonial administration,
Siempre y cuando, evidentemente,
namely, to pay taxes.
que les imponía la administración colonial alemana del pago de impuestos.
After Luderitz acquired those territories in 1883, he asked the German Empire to protect his property, which Bismarck rejected. But things changed a year later. One of the leading colonial merchants in the area, the German ship owner Adolf Woermann, owned several trading posts in what are now Liberia and Cameroon. He began to feel threatened by a treaty between Britain and France to divide up the territories in the region. He also started putting pressure on German authorities to provide support. Germany shared Woermann's concerns and changed its policies toward the colonies almost overnight. In April 1884, they established a protectorate over the territories Luderitz controlled. They called the area German Southwest Africa. In July 1884, Reich Commissioner Gustav Nachtigall signed protection treaties with local chiefs on the coast of Togo. Then Woermann's company in Cameroon signed a treaty with King Bell and King Aqua, the leaders of the Douala people, that gave the company sovereign, administrative, and legislative rights over their territory. The newly acquired territories were immediately recognized as a protectorate by the German Reich. Some historians claim that King Bell received 27,000 marks for signing the contract with the Woermann Company. At the time, that was a fortune. The German Empire's advance in East Africa was as quick and duplicitous as it had been in German Southwest Africa. In 1884, an openly racist journalist named Karl Peters founded the Society for German Colonization. From the start, Peters made it clear what his goal was: increasing the strength and enriching the lives of the stronger, better race at the expense of the weaker, lesser race. Although news traveled slowly to Europe at the time, Peters' brutality was no secret.
Every time a scandal reached Germany, for example when Karl Peters hanged his African concubine and her lover and razed their two villages to the ground because they had allegedly betrayed him, it caused public outcry.
Creaba una gran indignación en la opinión pública.
Back in 1884, almost a decade before those acts of brutality, Peters traveled to what's now Tanzania to negotiate pacts with local leaders on behalf of the Society for German Colonization. Through deception, misunderstandings, or violence, Peters got those leaders to cede large regions in exchange for cheap goods or vague promises. Karl Peters then presented these treaties to the German Reich and asked for protection, which he was granted in 1885. The colony of German East Africa was established. In 1890, Germany controlled these territories: Togoland, or German Togo, which included present-day Togo and some parts of Ghana; Cameroon, which wasn't just today's Cameroon, but also parts of modern-day Nigeria, Gabon, Chad, the Central African Republic, and Congo; German Southwest Africa, today known as Namibia; and German East Africa, which covered almost all of present-day Tanzania, along with Burundi and Rwanda. In 1884, the German Kaiser also established protectorates in Oceania, on Kaiser Wilhelm Land and the Bismarck Islands, which had been acquired by the German New Guinea Company. The same happened with the Marshall Islands in 1885, and 4 years later, the German Empire also took control of the Mariana Islands, the Caroline Islands, and German Samoa as part of its second colonial expansion. The Kiautschou Leased Bay Territory on the east coast of China in today's Xiaochu was one of the last German colonial acquisitions. It started with the killing of 2 German missionaries in 1897 by a local secret society which was against foreign influence. The death of the Catholic clergyman gave Kaiser Wilhelm II a pretext to take action. He telegraphed this message to Otto von Diederichs, the commander of the German East Asia Squadron. Immediately go to Xiaochu with the whole squadron, occupy suitable points and localities there, and enforce complete atonement from there in a way that seems suitable to you. Maximum energy required. Keep the destination of your journey secret. The German Reich also wanted to benefit from China in the same way as other Western powers who'd signed treaties there. The aim was to create a German Hong Kong with a naval base and a fleet to defend German interests in Asia. In March 1898, China ceded Xiaochu Bay and the surrounding area with a radius of 50 kilometers to Germany for 99 years. Beijing also had to grant Berlin mining rights and the right to construct and control railroad lines in the neighboring Shandong region. In 1900, China's Boxer Rebellion targeted foreigners and Chinese Christians. German diplomat Clemens von Ketteler was assassinated in the violence. A coalition of 8 foreign powers, including the German Empire, sent troops to China to quell the rebellion against Western and Japanese influence. When Kaiser Wilhelm II sent off his troops, he held a speech that would fill future generations of Germans with shame. If you come before the enemy, he will be defeated. No quarter will be given. Prisoners will not be taken. Whoever falls into your hands is forfeited. Just as 1,000 years ago the Huns under their king Attila made a name for themselves, one that even today makes them seem mighty in history and legend, so may the name Germany be affirmed by you in such a way in China that no Chinese will ever again dare to look askance at a German.
The colony of Kiaochu became a kind of personal project for the Navy Ministry. Admiral Tirpitz even spoke of this colony as a kind of showcase to demonstrate what the Germans were capable of when they set their minds to something. And indeed, Germany made huge investments in this small enclave in China to modernize the port infrastructure, create a telegraph system, build modern canal systems. All this was done because this colony was seen as a gateway to a gigantic market, the Chinese market, with 600 million potential consumers.
600 millones de consumidores potenciales.
The problem is that although Germany succeeded in selling many more of its industrial goods in China, the immense expectations that had been raised in German ministries and among the business elites were not fulfilled. Firstly, because German products had to compete with British, French, American, and Japanese products. And secondly, and most importantly, because the purchasing power of the 600 million Chinese was not sufficient to buy the exorbitant quantities of German industrial goods that the financial and political elites had dreamed of.
Despite the divide between the German colonial dream of being a major world power and reality, by 1890, the German Reich, which had only emerged around 20 years earlier with no colonial ambitions, had become the 3rd largest colonial empire in the world, after Great Britain and France. It covered more than 2.6 million square kilometers on 4 continents: Europe, Africa, Asia, and Oceania, and had a population of 13 to 15 million people. But this huge empire was never the El Dorado that German ministry officials dreamed of. Although the German colonies served to enrich many merchants, the financial elites and big banking houses were never willing to invest heavily in the colonies, considering it too risky. In addition, the colonies were bad for the state treasury, bringing more economic losses than profits. Of the entire vast colonial empire, only 2 small territories proved to be profitable for the German state: Togoland and German Samoa. These were small, ethnically homogeneous colonies in which the colonists never numbered more than 300 or 400 people. Was that the key to their profitability?
This forced the authorities to partially activate the local population so that the colonies could be administered. In other words, to allow the local elites to participate in the exercise of power, at least at the lower administrative levels. and also to encourage local producers to supply the German companies with the raw materials that German industry was looking for.
Compañías alemanas de las materias primas que la industria alemana estaba buscando.
The truth is, the rest of Germany's colonies were a financial drain. They didn't turn a profit at all.
So the bottom line is that the German Reich put much more money, weapons, and material into these colonies than it ultimately got out of them in terms of raw materials and financial profits. The German colonial business was a loss-making business.
The irony is that the Germans didn't hesitate to commit atrocities to maintain an empire that was a financial loss to their country. Part 3. Resistance. After years of land and resource theft, deception, military intimidation, forced labor, and abusive punishment, including flogging for minor offenses, resistance to German rule was growing. Although there had been local uprisings since the beginning of the German occupation of Africa, the first major rebellion was the Abushiri Revolt of 1888 in Tanganyika, now Tanzania. These territories had been administered since 1885 by the German East Africa Company, the successor organization to the Society for German Colonization, founded by Karl Peters, the racist ideologue. After signing a treaty with the Sultanate of Zanzibar to take control of its coastal territories in Tanganyika, the German East Africa Company raised its flag alongside the sultans in several towns. To many, especially among the Arab and Swahili populations, this was deeply humiliating. Attacks on German company posts and plantations soon followed. The revolt was led by a local merchant, Abushiri ibn Salim al-Harti, and quickly spread along the coast, forcing German officials to flee. Bismarck then called on Parliament to send a military expedition to Tanganyika. The mission branded Abushiri and the Arab and Swahili merchants as slave traders in order for Germany to say they were fighting slavery. Abushiri was indeed trafficking in human beings, but the fight against slavery was just a pretext to justify German colonization. The mission was approved, and Hermann Wissmann, an officer who'd already had experience in Africa, was sent to East Africa in 1889 as Reich Commissioner. He assembled a privately funded militia made up of German officers and more than 600 African troops of various ethnic backgrounds, with which he brutally crushed the uprising. Abushiri was taken prisoner and publicly hanged by German officials. The largest revolt took place from 1904 to 1908 in German Southwest Africa, current-day Namibia. Several thousand German colonists had settled there and claimed more and more land for themselves, while the indigenous population suffered increasing hardship due to drought and epidemics, and above all, the death of their livestock from cattle plague, which did not affect the Germans' vaccinated cattle. The Herero began buying livestock from the colonists, who demanded increasing prices, forcing the Herero to sell their land to pay for the cattle. At times, they were forced to take out unaffordable loans, which led to the confiscation of their property. In addition, there was the forced labor imposed on them by the colonial authorities, as well as brutal abuse and punishment by German troops.
In
all colonies, German and others, there was resistance, and resistance from the indigenous population from the very beginning. It's broken down with military power, the so-called punitive expeditions, which is of course a euphemism. Because how did the Europeans come to punish anyone at all? Punish for what? They punished them for not recognizing European rule, which the Europeans had conceded to each other.
In 1903, the colonial administration announced a plan to banish the Herero to reservations, which alarmed local indigenous leaders. When a German officer ordered the Herero to hand over their weapons, the local chief Samuel Maharero began organizing resistance with the help of other leaders. In 1904, they launched a surprise attack on German farms and military posts in the Okahanja region and destroyed railway and telegraph lines. The uprising spread to other areas, and more than 120 colonists and soldiers were killed. The rebellion took the German government by surprise. It decided to give General Lothar von Trotha command of its more than 15,000 troops to crush the uprising. Von Trotha was already infamous for brutally putting down the Boxer Rebellion in China, and he set himself a goal in Namibia, which he noted in his diary. The natives must be destroyed. Look at America, whether it be by the bullet or through missionizing or by brandy. With their spears and outdated rifles, the Herero had little chance against the German artillery and machine guns. Weakened by months of fighting and lack of food, the rebels finally gathered at the Waterberg Plateau. Von Trotha saw this as the perfect opportunity to surround and slaughter them in a single battle. He ordered his troops to attack from 3 different sides. Although the Herero suffered heavy losses, Von Trotha did not have enough soldiers to surround them completely. Most of the rebels were able to escape with their families and livestock into the Omaheke, the western extension of the Kalahari Desert. Von Trotha ordered his troops to pursue the stragglers and kill them, and to occupy the water sources. The Herero were forced to flee into the desert without food or water. Tens of thousands, including women, children, and old people, died of hunger, thirst, or exhaustion. Later, one of the German officers who pursued them through the scorched sands of the Kalahari wrote that the path by which the Herero escaped was littered with human skulls and skeletons, and thousands of cattle carcasses. In many places, holes were dug in the ground with hands or sticks to try to find water. On October the 2nd, Von Trotha issued an order that has gone down in history as the Extermination Order. He wrote directly to the Herero people. I, the great general of the German soldiers, send this letter to the Herero. The Herero are German subjects no longer. Any Herero found inside the German frontier, with or without a gun or cattle, will be executed. I shall spare neither women nor children. I shall give the order to drive them away and fire on them. Such are my words to the Herero people.
That is a social Darwinist idea. It's the idea that Germans need more space to develop as a racially superior people. That's what's behind it. That's also why they wanted to colonize in the empire, settlement colonies. Why they wanted to go to Namibia to create a second state populated by Germans, so to speak.
Samuel Maharero and some 1,500 other Herero were able to cross the Kalahari Desert and reach British colonial territory. Many Germans were unsettled by what was happening in Africa.
There are protests in Germany against the atrocities of the colonial war in Namibia and also in East Africa, what's Tanzania today. That was the case in the last years before the First World War, and it was a relatively broad front of protest. So the Social Democrats are there, the Liberals are there, the Catholics are there, meaning they're representatives in the Reichstag, in Parliament, and they represent a good 2/3 of the German population. What is not controversial is the colonial policy itself. The Social Democrats, the Liberals, and the Catholics are definitely all in favor of colonial policy. They also believe that whites and Germans are called upon to civilize other races and that colonial policy is simply necessary for this. The excesses of colonial policy are criticized, but colonial policy itself is not criticized. The Social Democratic Party was the first to denounce von Trotha's genocidal policies in German Southwest Africa. It even demanded his immediate dismissal and refused to approve the financing of the military expedition against the Herero and Nama.
As early as 1904, the same year Lothar von Trotha's massacres began, German socialist Rosa Luxemburg criticized the colonizers and their methods. Of course, our secret counselors know very well how to incite a campaign of revenge against the African Herero, against the beheaded Chinese, and to demand a life, no, thousands of lives, as atonement for every life destroyed by a German colonial adventurer. They know how to cry out for revenge for the honor of the Germans as soon as anyone anywhere in Honolulu or Patagonia dares to look askance at the Germans.
To a lesser extent, the party representing Catholics also took a critical stance toward colonialism, although unlike the Social Democratic Party of Germany, it could ideologically agree in principle with imperial policies, as it believed that this could serve the Catholic evangelization of Africa and Oceania. Its criticism did not lead to any improvement for these people, although it did at least publicize some of the atrocities committed in Africa and at least provided leverage. The emperor at least managed to ensure that those who had not taken part in the Herero uprising were pardoned and not shot directly, as von Trotha wanted.
habían participado en el levantamiento, pues debían ser perdonados y no directamente fusilados, como quería Fontjota.
But the Kaiser's orders did not stop the German troops from hanging many more indigenous people suspected of having supported the rebellion. In October 1904, the Nama people, who'd suffered the same brutality as the Herero, joined the revolt. Led by Hendrik Witbooi and Jacob Marengo, they conducted a guerrilla war that extended the uprising until 1908. At the end, the surviving Nama and Herero were put into concentration camps. The German troops were ultimately able to crush the rebellions. According to their own estimates, they killed 80% of the Herero population, more than 60,000 people, and 50% of the Nama population, some 10,000 people. With large areas of land now uninhabited, the number of settlers grew. In 1904, there were some 5,000 settlers in German Southwest Africa. By 1914, it was nearly 15,000. The genocide of the Herero and Nama may be the most well-known massacres of the German colonial empire, but they were not the last. In 1905, a year after the start of the Herero Rebellion, another insurrection broke out in German East Africa. It was set off by widespread hunger among the indigenous population after German colonists had acquired fertile lands. New taxes were then the spark that started the rebellion. Anyone who could not pay the tax was subject to forced labor. And that was on top of the unpaid work they were already being forced to do on communal cotton fields. But the colonial troops soon went on the offensive, arresting and executing family members of the rebels. To halt the uprising, they also destroyed areas where the rebels could find food and shelter. African colonial troops known as askaris burnt villages and fields, destroyed watering holes, and seized livestock. This scorched earth tactic eventually ended in insurrection. Although the authorities crushed the rebellion in 1907, the fighting led to a famine that decimated the rest of the population. The latest research puts the death toll of the conflict and famine at 300,000 people. But armed revolt was not the only means of resistance used by colonized people. Rudolf Manga Bell was the grandson of the same King Bell who'd signed the first treaty with the German Reich in Cameroon. After attending high school in Germany, Rudolf Manga Bell returned to his home country, where he became the chief of the Bell clan of the Douala people. There he learned of the German authorities' intention to take land away from his people, and he led a protest by several local leaders. Their protest consisted of sending numerous letters to the German parliament, in which Bell pointed out that the plans contravened the treaty signed with his grandfather in 1884. Initially, those letters were ignored, until they later found support from social democrats and centrist Catholics, who were debating in parliament the expropriation of land. Bell also tried to bring the case before the German courts, and sought support from other indigenous African groups and from other countries. And that turned out to be more than the German authorities were willing to tolerate. Rudolf Manga Bell was tried on charges of attempted treason, found guilty and sentenced to death, and he was hanged in August 1914. A square in Berlin was named after him in 2022. Part 4. Guilt and redemption. Germany's colonial empire was wiped out in far less time than it was created. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the 1919 Treaty of Versailles forced Berlin to cede all its overseas territories, most of which were taken over by France or Britain. And the leaders of the empire also lost power. But did their ideology of racial supremacy disappear too? Professor Jürgen Zimmerer is one of the leading proponents of what's called the continuity thesis. That's the idea that Germany's colonial crimes in Africa actually laid the groundwork for the Holocaust.
This is
30 years before the Nuremberg race laws, and there are race laws or race ordinances in German Southwest Africa. This obsession with race and racial purity, which has shaped German history right up to the present day, right up to the current debates about citizenship law, dual citizenship. All of this, these nationalist ideas, this obsession, was already present in the empire, or was born in the empire.
Ist im Kaiserreich bereits vorhanden oder entsteht im Kaiserreich. Es sind Gedanken,
There are thoughts, there are doctrines, there are ideas that are also used in the Third Reich, that can also be found in the colonies.
die eben auch schon in den Kolonien
I don't believe that people learned from Namibia, but there is simply a common root of colonial, ethnic thinking.
eine gemeinsame Wurzel einfach gibt, eines kolonialen, völkischen Denkens.
De acuerdo con el Plan Nacional Socialista, los territorios del este de
According to the
Europa
Nazi plan, the Eastern European territories were to become a kind of colony for Nazi Germany, and the Nazi authorities promoted behaviors typical of the colonial authorities in the African colonies, which were to be incorporated into the Germans' dealings with the local population.
la población local. O sea, en cierta manera, los nazis
In a way,
tomaron
the Nazis took an example from the racism applied by the German authorities in Africa and applied it in Eastern Europe towards the Slavic ethnic groups.
aplicarlo en Europa del Este con respecto a las poblaciones eslavas.
Hitler und die Nationalsozialisten
Hitler and the National Socialists draw the conclusion from the First World War that the German colonial empire must move from the south to the east. Hitler also said quite clearly that they wanted to create a German India in Ukraine or Russia.
ein deutsches Indien schaffen.
The Volga is our Niger River, and so on.
Unser Niger, also der
And that conveys this idea.
transportiert diese Vorstellung. Und der
And the
Zweite
Second World War in the East, in contrast to the Second World War in Western Europe, was a colonial war, a war of colonial conquest and annihilation.
Das heißt,
In other words, it draws on a similar pool of ideas as colonialism in Africa.
der Kolonialismus in Afrika. Aber beides hat
But both have an ethno-nationalist core, an ethno-nationalist idea of what Germanness actually is. And both are connected.
verbindet sich beides.
Today, countries like Poland are still demanding reparations for the massacres and devastation of World War II. How can Germany atone for atrocities committed even further back in time if neither the perpetrators nor the victims are still alive?
Alemania ha pagado muchos.
Germany has paid many billions in compensation, but on the one hand, to survivors of the Shoah or to survivors of the ghettos organized by Nazi Germany. And it has also paid reparations and compensation to non-Jewish survivors who were subjected to forced labor.
No judíos obligados a realizar trabajos forzados. Alemania
Germany largely clings to the fact that these reparations were paid to living persons in order to consider that it has no legal obligations to pay reparations to the Herero people, for example.
pagar reparaciones al pueblo Nama o al pueblo Herero, por ejemplo.
Die Frage ist ja,
So the question is, restitution to whom? To whom do you make atonement? Because legally it's not really possible. The perpetrators are long dead. They can no longer be prosecuted. The victims are also long dead. Their descendants are still alive, and there has been legal action by Namibians, especially the Herero and Nama in American courts, where they tried to argue that the Americans confiscated German capital and so should pay compensation. The American judges ultimately rejected that, and it finally failed in 2020. And then there were these other approaches, like compensation through social projects financed by Germany in Namibia. I don't want to judge whether that's enough or how much needs to be done now. The problem is how to deal with this history in a meaningful way.
In 2021, Germany's Foreign Office recognized that the German Reich had committed genocide in what's now Namibia. But that first step hasn't been followed by others.
Es gibt keine Anerkennung des
There is no official apology, and there has been no recognition of the genocide by the German Bundestag.
zu sagen, okay, wir
There is
erkennen
only
das
recognition by the Federal Foreign Office.
ja los.
The debate about Namibia started because the German Bundestag recognized the Armenian genocide.
Das war ja der Streit.
That was the point of contention. And Turkey and Erdogan pointed out, not unreasonably, that we should first recognize our own genocide, which took place 10 years earlier, before we can ascribe the genocide to the Turks, the Ottomans. The Holodomor, Stalin's genocide against the Ukrainians, has now been recognized in the wake of the Ukraine war. The genocide of the Yazidis has now been recognized by the Bundestag. The genocide of the Herero and Nama is not recognized. not even today.
Der Genozid an den Herero und Nama ist nicht anerkannt, bis heute nicht.
While it's no longer possible to compensate the victims of the atrocities themselves, what about the people whose ancestors were dispossessed by white families? The same families that often still own the land today.
In South Africa, there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which dealt with the crimes of apartheid. That had the advantage that the perpetrators, victims, and collaborators could come together at the same table. Then they explained their positions, shouted at each other, and argued and reproached each other, perhaps apologized, came closer together. They talked to each other. But in the end, that didn't solve all the problems. That's still not the case in South Africa today, but I would say that's actually the most appealing way of dealing with your past.
But in Namibia, the perpetrators and their victims can no longer shout at each other or sit at the same table. So what can Germany do?
I believe some kind of reparations are necessary. Given the genocides committed, it seems unlikely to me that this will happen unless it happens in the context of a much broader connection or deepening of relations, which includes the chapter on reparations for the genocides committed by the German colonial authorities.
Ich hatte das für Namibia vorgeschlagen.
I had suggested this for Namibia. You could be particularly generous. You shouldn't negotiate for every euro, because the point is that the land of the Herero and Nama was expropriated as a result of the genocide in Namibia, expropriated by the German government and given to white farmers. To this day, white farmers make up the majority of landowners, and since then, the Herero and Nama have effectively been day laborers on the farms of their forefathers with no prospects for the future. And it is about creating prospects for the future, not just getting rid of a historical debt through a ritual, but actually making a contribution. I was often told in Namibia, so that our children or grandchildren have a chance. We want them to have a future. I once suggested, why doesn't Germany simply pay for a university in southern Namibia, a kind of Silicon Valley high-tech university?
Warum zahlt Deutschland nicht einfach eine Universität im Süden Namibias? So eine Art Silicon Valley, High-Tech-Universität.
In 2021, Germany promised to spend another 1.1 billion euros over the course of 30 years in developmental aid. The Foreign Office called it a gesture of recognition of immeasurable suffering. But it said the gesture does not mean victims' families are entitled to reparations. Critics in Namibia say the money is not enough to fix the long-term damage and inequality still felt by young Namibians today.